Welcome to the Music Teachers in International Schools podcast. I'm your host, Chris Kulmer, and this episode was recorded live at the AMI Music Educators Conference. That's the Association for Music in International Schools. And we're at The Hague in the Netherlands, and I had the privilege of attending this conference, and of course I met hundreds of music teachers working in international schools all around the world, most of them following the American approach. Now, as some of our listeners will know, there are a number of different interpretations of what an international school is, and two of the dominant approaches of international schooling are those schools connected with the United States and those connected with countries in the United Kingdom. And obviously there's others as well. So today I'm speaking with Liam Callan, and Liam is a secondary music teacher and head of department at the American School Hong Kong. Liam has a fascinating story that connects deeply to international schooling and music education that I'm quite excited to explore today. So, Liam, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris. I'm super excited to chat today.
Now, you describe yourself in your LinkedIn page as composer, arranger, music educator, and third culture kid. Can you tell us about your upbringing? Maybe kind of where you were born, where you've lived, and where is home? Which could be a good question. And secondly, what does being a third culture kid mean to you?
Yeah, throughout my whole life, I've been asked the "where are you from" question, and it's a loaded one. I think I spent my childhood developing the 90-second elevator pitch. So the quick and short is my parents are Canadian. I was born in Hong Kong. I lived 5 years in Turkey, 5 years in Abu Dhabi, 7 years in Malaysia, went to college in the US, and now I'm all the way back full circle to Hong Kong. So I've never lived in my passport country. So home is a complicated concept, but it's really wherever I sleep. And that really is why, as a third culture kid, my identity is linked to wherever I choose to be.
Yeah, wow. And what was your favorite country growing up? Do you have one?
I definitely have ones that were less favorites, but it's hard. My heart's in Malaysia, and I think similarly to you, the country holds a special place to us. But for me, it was where I went to middle school and high school. The food, the people, the culture, which is inextricably linked to the food, the language. Malaysia is just home for me.
Yeah. And you were at the International School of Kuala Lumpur.
Yes, I was at ISKL, and as we probably will talk about, my parents are international teachers. So my dad was principal at ISKL. He was my middle school principal. I'm sure we'll unpack some of that trauma later. But I am a child of the system, and now I'm back in it.
Well, let's talk about that straight away. So your parents were international school teachers, principal, and...
My mom did a variety of things. So back in Hong Kong, my mom worked at Hong Kong University actually as a paralegal in the law department and was involved in the handover. And then she went from that to teaching home ec in Abu Dhabi, to teaching theory of knowledge for the IB, to being a college counselor, and somehow now has ended up being a Reiki master teacher. So
nice.
has shifted through many, many careers. She's a woman of many skills.
Great. And Dad was always principal, or did he teach in different roles?
No, he went overseas in 1989 for a year, went with the JET program, right, Japan English Teaching, which is a popular way back in the day that people ended up overseas. He was assuming he was going for 1 year to Osaka, moved to Hong Kong afterwards, where my mom moved with him, and taught social studies, English. In those days at the schools, you taught everything they gave you. Eventually ended up being a middle school principal in Turkey, and is now head of school at the International School of Kenya.
Okay, wow. And during the time in Malaysia, he was always the principal?
Middle school principal, yes.
Middle school principal.
Whole time. 9 years he was there.
Nice. So let's talk a bit about your experience of music education as an international school student in Malaysia. Describe what it was like. What do you remember? Maybe some of the positives, some of the maybe, I don't know if there was any negatives. Just take it where you want.
Well, I don't know if my teachers are listening to this, because many of them are still on the circuit, and a couple of them are actually here at the conference. But I think a big thing with international schools is the music department, as you said, is supported, right? It's a big part of it. And having grown up in that, I think music was always a big part of my life and my family. And I was lucky that whatever school I was at, in Malaysia in particular, the fine arts department is a cornerstone of the school. So I had the chance to play in a bunch of ensembles. I had teachers that were pushing me in directions that I didn't know I wanted to go, but very willingly. I wanted to be a trumpet player in 6th grade. And my middle school band director, James Houseco, said, "Oh, do you want to go on every school trip ever?" And I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." And he handed me a trombone. And lo and behold, he was right. Eventually, I did get to live my Miles Davis dreams and taught myself. But it was always so many opportunities to go out and play and travel. And now, you said we were at the AMI conference. I was an AMI student. So in high school, I got the chance to travel to London, and they came to Kuala Lumpur one year, and then Zurich was my last year, participate in the AMI jazz festivals. And just getting to work with student instrumentalists from all over the world was huge. And in the year I graduated, just from the AMI conference, 4 of us ended up at Berklee. So we and 2 of us didn't even know we were ending up there, so we just bumped into each other at check-in. And
Wow.
You already build this network of friends in these international school settings that you would never have otherwise.
That is brilliant. So you literally rocked up at check-in. You were like, "I know you. You
Yes.
were."
And it was hilarious because one of them was at the American school in Japan, and he was, Berklee is divisive, obviously. He was the person that was saying, "Oh, Berklee's terrible, man. It's the chord factory," and he was trash talking it. And the second he showed up at check-in at Berklee, we all just laughed at him. It was great because he was an alto player that thought he was so good. He was gonna go to the new school, and I love Berklee, and I was very much on the Berklee train in high school, and he just made fun of us, and then he showed up to check-in, and it was just the sweetest moment.
Yes, the irony. Very nice. So firstly, trumpet player, so trumpet's your main instrument, or no?
Trombone, because
okay.
I wanted to be a trumpet player,
Yeah.
and then I have the personality type of a trombone player, and my teacher wanted to push me to have better chances in international auditions.
Yeah.
So I went trombone first for school, but I had picked up classical guitar when I was 8.
Okay.
So my dad is a guitarist and a vocalist, a hobbyist. And I got a guitar for my 8th birthday, or maybe Christmas, some event.
Yep.
And started taking private lessons and got really into that and got to 6th grade and walked into the band room like, I'm a guitarist. I can play guitar in band. And no. So
Okay.
so my band teacher handed me a trombone, and the rest kind of went from there.
Yeah. And hence every trip, because yay, trombone player, we need you for everything. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. So did you always have the idea in mind of pursuing a career in music education, both?
It was the opposite of most parent-child relationships, where I didn't want to pursue music.
Okay.
I was very much a pragmatic realist. I was, going to these schools. So many of your friends are going into economics, engineering, medicine, the big money jobs, that I felt an internal pressure to go in that direction. And so I applied to a lot of schools for economics and pre-law. And Berklee was one that, and several other music schools. My parents pushed me to actually do it. So throughout high school, outside of school, my parents pushed me to pursue the singer-songwriter thing. I produced an album, I toured, got radio play in 5 countries, and really fell in love with professional music in the summers. And then, auditioned for Berklee thinking if I got in, I had to do it, because I could always go back and get a law degree later in life. There's only a certain window of pursuing professional musicianship, when you can sleep 2 hours a night for a month. And I never thought I would go into education, but I took one intro to ed class at my college, and I took it because all of the education terms had been dinner conversation for years and years and years. So I wanted a bird course where I could just go in and throw around the term UBD a bunch, and then so talk about Bloom's taxonomy. I'm like, I know all this, and get an easy grade. And I didn't realize I walked into my first day of intro to education, and my teacher was also in the jazz composition department as a full-time composer, a man named Omar Thomas, still who I want to be when I grow up. Incredible jazz composer and educator. And that moment I just went, I can do both. I can write, I can perform, I can tour, and also love education. And I think for a long time I was running from my father's shadow of all teachers' kids become teachers. And I tried to reject that. But the second I got out of the shadow in college and took that course, it was like, man, not only do I know a lot of these terms, I actually like doing this.
I want to talk more about your teaching, obviously, and where that's led you. But I'm fascinated by what you said about how a lot of your friends were pursuing the big money careers and you were encouraged to pursue music and you felt that pressure. There's so much we could talk about there, but
Yeah.
I want to dig in a little bit more on this because it's one of the things that comes up quite regularly with international schooling, this kind of pressure on students. Did you feel any of those barriers, and I hope we can go there with this, but did you feel any of those barriers to a music career from the outside, or was it purely internal where you were really kind of grappling with this idea?
I was lucky that mine was entirely internal, right? And I think if there was any external pressure, it was from my friends. But not because they were doing anything to me. I was just watching what they were doing and assuming that, go with them, do the thing that they're doing. Because still to this day, many of my friends are engineers. And when we get together, they all have that in common. And I was the arts kid. But no, the structure of our program, the way the school respected and treated the music department as a core subject was really helpful. And I, with all the self-doubt that I had, I don't think I would have ended up in music if the structures around me hadn't have supported it.
Amazing.
And so as a teacher, that's one thing that I really want to do. And I think especially in East Asia and Southeast Asia, that idea of parents love music, but God forbid their child pursue it. Yes, it's always a supplementary thing. It's always because they know it's incredibly important for development. They're in private lessons, they're doing competitions, they're doing all of this stuff, and they support music until exam years come up. And making sure that kids can still enjoy it and know it's a viable option for a career is a big part of why I ended up in it.
Have you come across some strategies? I mean, you mentioned creating that environment for your students, but as a teacher now, what are some of your strategies like for approaching this contradiction?
Yeah. For me, it's legitimizing things that aren't performance. And this is one thing that I think institutionally, the older international schools, the bigger ones, the legacy ones, have failed at a lot of the time. And the new, younger generation of teachers are trying to move this. But when you look at a music program that is band, choir, orchestra, when you have a visiting artist, it is a performer. They are somebody coming in. To be a successful musician, you must be able to blow into a tube well, or hit something with a stick well. And there's so many jobs outside of that, even in just the audio space, not necessarily music, that kids don't know about. And I forget the statistic off the top of my head, but there's always that one we throw around, 25% of the jobs our kids will have in 10 years don't exist yet. Made up number, but that's the idea. So making sure that I stay informed with what my friends are doing in the industry. And I was lucky to go to a school where my friends who graduated with music degrees are doing incredibly diverse things. So being able to feature friends of mine that work fully for television. So I have a friend who does a lot of the sound recordings and sound effects for various shows and movies. And one that just recently came up is I have a ninth grade trumpet player who's half decent trumpet player, probably not going to pursue trumpet performance, but is a tinkerer and very STEAM oriented and engineering process. And he was making additions and changing out the keys on his trumpet to like cocoboa wood keys and stuff, like beautiful work. And he'd never heard of the concept of luthiering, like building instruments. And so being able to introduce a 14-year-old to that, because he loves music and he loves building things, but he's not going to be the principal trumpet player for the Chicago Phil. His mind just exploded. And, I don't know what he's going to be doing in 4 years, but it's something that a traditional program probably wouldn't have made him aware of.
So let's talk a bit more about your role currently, because we've kind of segued there anyway. So you're now in Hong Kong. tell us a bit about, maybe you can describe your program. What does your music program look like? Maybe based on what you've just explored with us. I'm fascinated by this. Tell us about it.
So this is my 4th year in Hong
Okay.
Kong. The school's in its 8th year, so it's a younger school. Population a little over 300. So, it's dipped and waned during COVID, but we've come back up to where we were pre-COVID. And when I came in, it was a very small, underserved program. So I was brought in to redo the whole thing. And music is mandatory. It's compulsory for all students at that time from 6th grade to 9th grade, which is where the school ended. And each year that we've developed, we've added on a year. So now we are K-12. And so currently I teach 6 through 12. The last 2 years are IBDP. So I have students in there. And then 6 through 8, we have 3 40-minute blocks a week for music, which includes general band technology. We'll talk about that. And in 9th grade, this is the first year that finally won this battle, that students can specialize in either art or music. And instead of taking 3 of each, they have 6 of the one they choose. So I get 240 minutes a week with 9th and 10th, and 120 minutes a week with 6 through 8. How I divide it up is I generally do 2 blocks a week, 80 minutes of band, right? We are an American school. That was the prerogative given to me, was build a band program. And luckily I'm a wind instrumentalist. That's my home. I'm a jazz guy, so it's a jazz program. And then the other 40-minute block, or the other third, generally is harmony, composition, music technology, concept-based learning, project-based learning. So I have students from 6th grade up working with movable do solfege, functional harmony, everything we do in band, they sing in movable do solfege. So by the time they're in 9th and 10th grade, we're doing modal composition. And by the time, ideally, by the time they're in 11th grade for the IBDP, they have a really solid handle on jazz harmony instead of classical tonal harmony. And we can talk about why that's important later if you're interested in that.
Let's go there now.
Okay.
Why have you focused on that with the IBDP?
Yeah, for me, I grew up classical, right? I grew up as a classical guitarist, did my ABRSM and Trinity exams, was a good boy, did all my exams, got my distinctions, and I was a musical exclusionist, where I very much was classical was music, and everything else is lovely, but it's not classical music. And I think...
Can I just interrupt? Where did that come from? Where did that idea?
Again, intrinsic. It was internal.
Okay.
It was me. And I think it's not at no fault of my teachers, no fault of my parents. I just, for some reason, elevated classical music as this unattainable thing to be a classical musician. And it changed around 9th grade when I started playing in the jazz band at school. And it was very much like, improvisation, that's easy. And suddenly I was bad at something. And I was like, oh man, this is hard. And I wanted to conquer it to spite it. Not because I wanted to be good at it, because I wanted to prove that it wasn't as hard as classical.
Right.
And in doing that, I Stockholm syndromed myself into falling in love with jazz. And I was composing, I was songwriting, I was doing all that, and I got my diploma in classical theory through the ABRSM, right? Again, fit the mold.
Yeah.
And to me, classical theory was oil paint, right? It's rigid, it's beautiful. You can create incredible things with it, but it's very color within the lines. Mm-hmm. And I ended up taking some jazz harmony courses to better understand playing jazz. And to me, jazz harmony is watercolor. It's so much more malleable, and both can be used to create incredible things. But I think jazz harmony, when you're a developing musician, doesn't promote fear of making mistakes, right? When we learn classical theory as a 12, 13, 14-year-old, there's very much a wrong answer, right? Parallel fifths, get out of here. We're not doing that, right? You're not Debussy. Who do you think you are? But I've seen so many students, especially in East Asia, where classical theory rules the roost, feel bad every time they do something wrong. And in jazz harmony, I have the ability to be like, that's not what we're looking for, but you put a flat 9 on that chord. Cool. Save that tension for later. Maybe it's not appropriate for a golden era contrafact, But when we get to bebop, I want you to remember that flat nine's going to come in handy.
Cool.
So it's a more diverse and more mistake-friendly palette to write with. And I think it also, I'm a harmony first person. I just went to a session yesterday with Jody Blackshaw and Chris Ward and Eric Bennett, and they talked about the musical orientations. Like, are you melody first, harmony first, rhythm first? And learning jazz harmony just opened my eyes to, I am harmony first. I build chords, and then I build melodies.
Yeah.
And that color, to me, is jazz harmony.
So how then do you approach that with, I mean, you mentioned the idea of students from East Asia potentially having this ingrained classical West is best kind of approach. What's a strategy or some strategies that you found have worked for getting this idea across, this watercolor painting idea across of jazz harmony? How does that work in the classroom?
I think just providing real world examples of things that they already know exist, but they might not have thought about. I think K-pop is the greatest resource in the world for this. If you look at your BTSs, your EXOs, they're all jazz harmony, right? Everything that BTS has put out is basically 1970s Marvin Gaye inspired R&B, soul, which tracks all the way back to jazz. And for students in East Asia, the African diaspora and like African American music and Black music and culture is something they never encounter. But when you can draw a through line from what they live in now to that and say, wouldn't you want these tools to build? That's when they start being receptive. And if they're not, I try to have them justify why they're not. And honest, they don't have an answer most of the time, right? If you say like, okay, movable do, fixed do, right? This is one I have to fight constantly. New kid comes into the school, 14, public school in Hong Kong. C is do, always. Why? They can't justify it, right? So it's like teaching lattice multiplication versus your multiplication tables. I just say, hey, here's another way to do it. Here's why we're doing it. Can you explain why you don't want to do it this way? Why is your way superior?
So it's the conversation, it's the questioning, it's
yes,
pedagogy, right? Like,
yeah.
And for those who haven't heard BTS, I'm just thinking of some listeners that might be like, who's BTS? If you haven't heard of them, you've got to listen to them because, in terms of K-pop, huge, influencing a whole scope of music that's just so important to students these days. It's really well referenced. I like that. Love it. So I think one would be interesting. An interesting question here would be IBDP then. What are your numbers like?
Yeah, I think it's important to know the size of my grades in general because that definitely reflects it. I have, there are 11 kids in our graduating class right now, so it's a really small class. I have 3 in my graduating class. So
that's great.
For IB Music, I graduated a class of 153, and I was the only IB Music student, and I did it as an independent learning program. Yeah. So I didn't even have, I had a mentor, but I didn't have a teacher for it. And then in my 11th grade year, my first year DP year, I have 1, a drummer, wonderful. And then coming up, I already have 3 that have decided, possibly 4 for next year. So small enough groups that we can cover a lot of cool, diverse stuff, but not overwhelmingly large. I was talking to teachers here that have 17 in their DP graduating class, and I don't know how I could teach any other course if I had 17 in that course.
Yeah, that's a lot. Nice. Well, that's great. That's like, 25% of your cohort is taking music. I've got so many questions I'd like to ask, but I want to go to one of my favorite questions. And I think this will be really interesting with your background. So what do you think makes a good international school music teacher?
What makes a good teacher in general, I think, is differentiation. And I think we take that to another level. Where if you're back in North America or Australia or Europe in a national school, you're generally serving a monolinguistic community and often a monocultural, monoethnic community. And being in an international school, suddenly you have a bunch of different cultures you know nothing about in your classroom. And I think walking in with humility to that and treating your kids as teachers in that way is a big thing. Being able to, I speak multiple languages, but none of them are East Asian tonal languages. So when I'm trying to approach local music, the first people I go to are my kids. So differentiating and respecting, not tolerating, but respecting and learning about your host culture and your host country is huge. And there's an ego to a lot of artists with that, where we feel like we have to know where we are, what we're doing. I stand on the podium and white man with a red beard lectures about Chinese music. Not the place to be. Not a healthy way to be. So I think letting students teach you about the cultures they're from and let them explore that in an academic way, because we have the tools to help them learn how to research. Just because we don't have the knowledge of the subject doesn't mean we don't have the tools to help them use their knowledge to develop understanding.
Do you have any examples that come to mind of a student that's taught you something that you're like, ding, like light bulb moment?
Constantly. I think the new IBDP curriculum, not without its flaws, has done this so many times in the last year for me. I have a brilliant student in my graduating class. He's 13, and he's graduating IBDP. Incredible math, science brain, took Area 6 art because it was his weakness. And he wanted to take IBHL music. And mind you, this kid's weakness is all of our strengths. So polyglot, speaks 5 languages. And what he did for his exploration portfolio was do a linguistic analysis and melody writing for Japanese. This Japanese pop song, and kind of goes into that same like East Asian J-pop, C-pop, K-pop. There's this group called Yaosobi, and they have this song called Into the Night, is the English translation. And he did an investigation of rhythmic displacement based on tenses in Japanese. The verses are all in present tense, and everything in present tense in Japanese, or at least this dialect, is rhythmically on beat. But when you speak in the past tense, there's this concept of this thing called sokuan, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. He would know better. But it's where the beginning of a sentence starts on beat, and then everything else is syncopated. So that there's a flow to language which we don't have in English. And I don't speak a language of this region. So he was able to put in rhythmic figures, which is the way that, Western music theory person can understand it, how putting it in the past tense created all this 16th note syncopation. Just based on narrative storytelling and tenses and language, it informed how the composer wrote the melodic rhythm.
This kid's 13.
Yes, this kid's 13.
There's like a PhD in this.
Honestly, and he's going into theoretical mathematics, so
okay.
He could do anything he wanted. But at the same time, I watched that inform another student's paper where she was investigating melody writing in Chinese pop music. And another thing that I had no idea, but using that knowledge that he did in his paper, she was like, oh, why are canto pop and mando pop melodies so simple? Right? If you look at them, they're all very quarter note, eighth notes based. And her finding was that it's because the language is monosyllabic. Every word, every idea is one character. So when you're writing a melody, you don't have to worry about syllables. You don't have to worry about how many multisyllable, in a word, right? When you use the word persiferate in an English song, you have to think about how that rhythmically displaces. Yeah. But with Mandarin and Cantonese, you have tones to do that. So everything is one syllable. So melodies are often super simple because a word is always one thing. English songwriting is a mess. English is the worst language to learn on earth, in my opinion, because our flow, our syntax, there's 1,000 exceptions to every rule. And so it was really interesting that I learned so much from the student's Japanese analysis, and then I watched another student 2 weeks later use that to learn something completely different that I also had my mind blown by. It's really cool.
That is really cool. So it's almost like you learn not only about some kind of crazy, culturally diverse musical elements, but you learn about language, probably learn about culture as well as a construct, and that was all informed by students, and then students informing other students, and so on.
Yes.
Very nice. I love that. Great. So what's the future? Where do you think you're heading career-wise? I mean, it sounds like you're already on a really nice trajectory, small school, you've been able to build a program, do some unique things. what's next? Do you want to stay in Hong Kong for a little longer?
Yeah, I'm thrilled with where I'm at. The school that I'm at was I'm very early in my career. I just turned 27 last month, so I have a lot to do still in what I want to do. But I was so lucky that I got this job straight out of my student teaching, and have grown incredibly there. I'm planning to stay at least one more year, probably two. I love Hong Kong. We're finally getting to a point where Hong Kong is, I don't want to say returning to normal, but it is opening up. But in the future, I see myself being in the classroom for at least another 10 years. My plan is to hopefully, move out of the classroom full time around the time I turn 35. I have a company that I'm currently in the workshop stages of licensing and getting off the ground. That is a sheet music distribution company for education that represents underserved artists, intersectional, diverse, young composers, and connects them with educators because they have the composition ideas and the educators know what a 12-year-old trumpet player can do. So bringing out composers that represent the communities that are playing them, right? Inner city Detroit, if they're playing Bach, you can't tell me that a 14-year-old girl from Detroit cares about, a dead white Austrian man. You can say that if somebody grew up in Cleveland and is 25 and grew up underserved, impoverished, and is now a composer, that's the person that should be in the room with them. They should be playing that person's music. So I would like to move to that at some point in my career full time.
And where's that up to? You said you're in the workshop stages. Are you working with some composers? Anything? Yep.
Yeah, I have a collection of people, and this has been a long percolating project. This was a drunken night in college where we were all sitting around with a bunch of music business majors, and I'm the only ed major there. And somebody said, what would they were doing an entrepreneurship course, like creating a business, and there are the obvious ones like a production company or a management. And somebody looked at me and said, what would it even look like for education? What would educational entrepreneurship look like for music? And I said, look, I'm tired of playing dead white German men. I think it's incredibly important that we study them, but the percentage of our curriculum, and I don't want to call out orchestra, but orchestra specifically, I love Messiah, but I don't want to hear Handel's Messiah every year. We're literally sitting in a room with a big Bach poster in the corner.
I intentionally set the cameras up so that it wasn't.
Yeah. So and it came up like this is what I thought it would be, and it would be a subscription-based model where schools basically paid into this fund that supported young composing artists. That supported students going to college for composition-based, creation-based degrees, and came out of it to communities that need representation in professional music. Because I think for too long we've treated music band programs, orchestra programs, choir programs as non-real world pageantry. It doesn't connect to the industry anymore. Because realistically, how many of our kids, 1% of our kids will become musicians, and what percentage of those kids are playing for a Philharmonic? So why are we simulating that now? But that came up, we workshopped it, we priced it out, we named it, it's Lieder, as in the German folk song, and all the puns wrote themselves. Right? Leadership would be the scholarships for kids in college. It's all good fun. But COVID hit. We were planning on soft launching a couple years ago, and I have a collection of teachers and a collection of composers from a bunch of different schools, ones that I went to school with, ones that were friends of those people. So hopefully, it being end of 2022, I hope to start soft launching this in a couple of years. And anybody listening to this is welcome to reach out to me to be a part of that soft launch program. It probably will be in a couple of years, but if this is intriguing at all to you, I don't want to make it a podcast about it, but please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, great. Do you have a link that we could send listeners to?
It's all locked up right now because we're still in the website design, and we put it completely on pause during this. But my website is liamcallanmusic.com, or email is liamcallanmusic@gmail.com.
Nice.
That's the place to reach out to me now.
We'll put something in the show notes, especially, well, at least email addresses and things for people to contact you. But that sounds great. Very cool. Was there anything else that you wanted to share with our listeners about your upbringing, your teaching now in Hong Kong, anything else at all?
Yeah. I think the big thing for me being international is just making family. It's more than making friends. And I think coming back to the conference now has reminded me of that. As we're all coming out of the cave of the last few years, Hong Kong's one of the last places to come out of that cave. We're still emerging. But it's just reminded me something that I forget, which is it's not just reaching out for help. It's just reaching out for understanding and companionship. That so many people are doing what you do, but in such different ways. And conversations like this, conversations that I've been having this weekend, just remind me how cool what we do is. And back in the States, back in Canada, you go to an MMEA or a TMEA, any of the big conferences, and you go around the group and it's like, I'm a band director. Oh, I'm a band director. I'm a band director. And everyone does the same thing. You commiserate about marching band, about competitions. And then you come out here and you have a conversation. You say, okay, we all teach music. I teach 6 through 8, general instrumental technology. What do you do? And they're like, oh, I teach MYP. I teach PYP. It's all these different areas of the same art that we're a part of. And I think the big thing is just you can learn so much from the people around you in this community especially. And again, just ditch the ego. That's something I've always struggled with, but
I like it. It's a good piece of advice. Liam, thanks so much for taking the time, for sharing your story, your background, for digging into some of these kind of quite tricky subjects. I think you've probably sparked some interesting ideas for our listeners. So thanks for going there with that. That was really cool. And like I said earlier, we'll put a whole bunch of information in the show notes on the website so people can get in touch with you. I really look forward to keeping in touch.
Absolutely.
And hearing where this next 10 years, I mean, you've got it kind of planned out. I like your 10 years, 35, I'm going to be doing this. So I hope we can kind of touch base along the way and see where the journey goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Music Teachers in International Schools podcast. Listen to other episodes by visiting mtiis.com or learn more about our community on Facebook by simply searching for Music Teachers in International Schools. If you know someone who you think I should get on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me at chriskoelma.com, ChrisKoelma.com. See you next time.